There are 3 settings that really affect your exposure. They also come with little side effects. Your shutter speed is going to control how much motion blur is in your image. Aperture will affect your depth of field. ISO is going to affect how much noise is in the footage. You can use those settings to make something look really dreamy, or you can use it to make things look really gritty. Having a firm understanding of manual exposure really helps you to understand filmmaking. Hello, my name is Caleb Osterling, and today we're going to be talking about manual exposure. So exposure is how much light is hitting the sensor. The more light is hitting the sensor, the brighter the image is, and the less light is hitting it, the darker the image is. There are 3 main settings that control how much light is hitting the sensor, and those settings are your shutter speed, aperture, and your ISO. Each of those is going to adjust a quality of your image. You have your lens, and you have your camera sensor, and between those is a little door called the shutter. Whenever an image is taken, that shutter opens, letting some light in, and then it closes. Faster it opens and closes, the less light can get in, and that means you're going to have a darker image. The slower it opens and closes, the more light comes in and the brighter your image. It's pretty simple. The high numbers mean fast shutter speed, and a low number means low shutter speed, and what these numbers are is they're fractions of a second. 120 means 1/120th of a second. That's going to be how fast the shutter's moving. Your shutter speed also controls how much motion blur you get. Here you can see as the object is moving, we have it at a high shutter speed. It looks a little weird. This kind of look is usually used for intense scenes and fight scenes where they want things to look really gritty or unsettling. This next shot, we have a very low shutter speed, and that low shutter speed creates a lot of motion blur and kind of unnatural amount of motion blur. So with all that being said, where should your shutter speed really be? The widely accepted rule of thumb is called the 180-degree rule. And what this rule is that whatever your frame rate is, your shutter speed is going to be double of that. If your frame rate is 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 1/48th of a second. If your frame rate is 30 frames per second, you would want 1/60th of a second, so on and so forth. Where shutter speed is something that applies to the camera, aperture is something that applies to the lens. Your lens has blades inside, and they form this little circle that allows light in. And the wider open that circle is, the more light's getting in, and the more closed it is, the less light is coming in. Now, your aperture is always going to be measured in f-stops or t-stops if you're using a cinema lens like this one. The smaller that number is, the more wide open, and the higher the number, the more closed down it is. When you have a really closed down aperture, it's going to give you what's called a deep depth of field. Everything in the image is going to be in focus at once. Right here we have a deep depth of field. It's kind of making it look like the man is pretty close to the tank. Also, if I go ahead and try to rack focus, you barely see anything changing. This can be great if you want things to look really big, or you have multiple people standing different distances from the camera and you want them all in focus at the same time. Now for this next image, I have the aperture open really wide, and we have this nice shallow depth of field. I can do a nice rack focus, and we can see how the man goes out of focus and the tank comes into focus. And then here we can rack focus over to my son, who is attacking the tank while I'm filming this demonstration. When I'm shooting weddings, I usually keep it between 2.8 going up to 5.6. Occasionally I'll drop down lower than 2.8 if I want something to look very, very dreamy. So if you're looking for really shallow depth of field, you want to go for your prime lenses. That means they don't zoom in or out, but they give you really, really nice image. So here's how ISO works. Your electronic sensor, when it gets hit by light, produces a whole bunch of little number values. What ISO does is it boosts those values. Makes the image a little bit brighter. However, the more it does that, you start getting things like artifacts and noise in the image, and your colors start to fade. Typically, you want to try to keep that ISO down pretty low. When you're controlling how bright or dark the image is, there's really a lot of give and take. For example, You go outside, your image is overexposed because it's just so bright out. Your ISO is already all the way down, so maybe you just close down the aperture. So you bring that f-stop up and okay, everything looks properly exposed, but everything's in focus. And maybe you don't want everything in focus. You open your aperture back up, bring up the shutter speed. Now everything looks properly exposed, but everything also looks choppy. Well, this is when something like ND filters come in handy. ND filters are a dark piece of glass that you can put in front of your lens. It will make the image darker without you needing to adjust any settings. You use these so you can keep the settings a particular way, but not have the image overexposed. So now let's say you're indoors, you have your shutter speed set the way you want, you have your aperture set the way you want, but there's not that much light. So you bring up your ISO, but you have to bring that ISO up so much that now you have a grainy image. You may want to look into noise reduction softwares. I use a program called Neat Video, and it does a really good job at getting rid of noise. There's a lot of different avenues of photography and filmmaking that there are to learn, and sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. But thankfully, there are loads of resources out there, and I would love to be one of those resources. If you like this video, go ahead and hit subscribe, and I'm going to be coming out with more content to try to help move you along the path of great cinematography or photography. Thank you so much. My name is Caleb Oshling, and this is Prodotank.